May 8th, 1945, 8:30 in the evening. A column of battered vehicles stretches along a muddy road in western Czechoslovakia. Nearly 1,000 trucks, half-tracks, and armoured vehicles crawl westward through the fading light. Inside them sit the remnants of what was once one of the most feared fighting formations in the world. The soldiers are exhausted, filthy, many of them wounded. Their uniforms are torn and stained with the grime of 6 years of continuous warfare. Their faces tell the story of men who have seen everything, done everything, and lost everything. Just hours earlier, Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over, and these men, the survivors of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, were racing against time. Behind them, the Red Army was closing in. Soviet tanks and infantry were sweeping through Czechoslovakia, and every man in that column knew what capture by the Soviets would mean. They had fought the Russians from the gates of Moscow to the ruins of Budapest. They had committed acts that would haunt history for generations. The Soviets would show no mercy. At the head of the column, SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Weidinger, commander of the Der Führer regiment, had negotiated a desperate deal with Czech partisans. Safe passage westward in exchange for surrendering to the Americans rather than fighting to the death. The partisans agreed. Perhaps they simply wanted the Germans gone from their country as quickly as possible. Perhaps they calculated that American prisoners would face justice eventually. Whatever the reason, the column pushed on through the gathering darkness. The next morning, May 9th, 1945, the remnants of Das Reich reached the American lines near the town of Rokycany, close to Pilsen. There, they surrendered to soldiers of the 2nd United States Infantry Division. The end had finally come. A division that had once numbered over 17,000 men, that had fought in Poland, France, Yugoslavia, the Soviet Union, Normandy, the Ardennes, and Hungary, was finished. The last radio message from the Deutschland regiment captured the totality of the defeat. The regiment, now completely cut off, without supplies, with losses of 70% in personnel and equipment, at the end of its strength, must capitulate. Tomorrow the regiment will march into captivity with all heads held high. This is the story of that division, a formation born from political fanaticism that became one of the most effective fighting units of World War II. A division that reached the outskirts of Moscow in the winter of 1941, that recaptured Kharkov in Germany's last great victory, that fought at Kursk in history's largest tank battle, and that left a trail of atrocities across Europe that would forever stain its military record. This is the story of Das Reich, the Panzer Division that fought on every front and lost. The origins of Das Reich stretch back to 1934, 5 years before the war even began. On September 24th of that year, Adolf Hitler authorized the creation of a new armed force within the SS, separate from both the regular German army and the concentration camp guards. This force was called the SS Verfügungstruppe, which translates roughly as SS dispositional troops. They were meant to be political soldiers, fanatically loyal to Hitler personally, ready to carry out any mission the Nazi regime required. They would answer to Heinrich Himmler and the SS hierarchy, not to the traditional military establishment. The man who transformed these political soldiers into a professional military force was Paul Hausser, a retired Army Lieutenant General who joined the SS on November 15, 1934, at the age of 54. Hausser was an unlikely figure for the SS. He was a career military officer, trained in the traditions of the old Prussian army, with decades of experience in conventional warfare. He had no particular ideological fervour, and had joined the SS primarily because it offered him an opportunity to continue his military career after retirement from the regular army. But Hausser saw an opportunity to build something from scratch. He applied rigorous military standards to SS training at officer schools in Bad Tölz and Braunschweig. He demanded discipline, tactical proficiency, and physical conditioning that matched or exceeded regular army standards. The men came to call him Papa Hausser. Without his influence, the Waffen-SS would likely never have achieved the combat reputation it later gained. He gave them the skills to survive on the battlefield. Their ideology gave them the will to use those skills without mercy. By 1939, 4 armed SS regiments existed, though they would never all serve together in a single division. The Leibstandarte was Hitler's personal bodyguard unit and would always hold a special status, eventually forming its own separate division. The Deutschland Regiment was based in Munich under the command of Felix Steiner. The Germania Regiment was based in Hamburg, and Der Führer was formed in Vienna after Germany absorbed Austria in the Anschluss of 1938 under Georg Kepler. The division that would become Das Reich would comprise 3 of these regiments, but never the Leibstandarte. These units were filled with volunteers who met strict physical and ideological standards. Recruits had to trace their Aryan ancestry back generations. They had to meet minimum height requirements. They trained harder and longer than regular army units. They were equipped with the latest weapons, and they believed utterly in their mission to serve as the vanguard of the Nazi state. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, the SS regiments saw their first real combat, but they did not fight as a unified division. Instead, they were scattered among various army formations and used piecemeal. The results were decidedly mixed. The SS troops fought with reckless aggression, charging into enemy fire with fanatical determination, but they also suffered excessive casualties due to poor tactical leadership and a lack of combined arms coordination. The regular army looked down on them as amateurs playing at soldiers, brave but foolish men who confused courage with competence. Army generals complained that the SS units required constant support and rescue. Hitler settled the dispute by ordering the SS regiments to form their own divisions. They would operate under Army Tactical Command during operations, but would remain administratively separate under Himmler's SS. In early October 1939, the SS Verfügungsdivision was officially established, with Paul Hausser assuming command on October 19th. A new symbol was chosen for the division, the Wolfsangel, an ancient Germanic rune that resembled a stylized letter Z with a vertical line through it. This wolf's hook symbol would be painted in white or yellow on the division's vehicles throughout the war, a marker that would eventually become synonymous with both military prowess and unspeakable atrocity. The division's name would change several times over the following years, each change reflecting organizational upgrades and the division's growing power. In December 1940, it became SS Division Reich. In May 1942, the name was modified to Das Reich, meaning the Empire or the Realm. The name expressed the unit's ideological purpose. It existed not merely to fight for Germany, but to embody and serve the entire German Reich. By October 1943, after years of expansion and upgrading, it had become the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, a fully equipped armoured formation with its own tank regiments, artillery battalions, and support units. It was capable of fighting any enemy formation on the planet on equal terms. The division's first major test came during the invasion of France in May 1940. For this campaign, the division was split between multiple axes of advance. The Der Führer regiment participated in the ground assault into the Netherlands, where SS Oberscharführer Ludwig Keplinger became the first non-commissioned officer in the Waffen-SS to receive the Knight's Cross by storming Fort Westervoort on the Ijssel River on May 10th. During the assault, Keplinger was wounded 5 times, struck in the hand, twice in the upper thigh, and twice in the lower abdomen, but continued leading his 18-man unit until the position was secured. The rest of the division crossed into the Netherlands, and by May 12th had reached Rotterdam. By late May, Das Reich was fighting on the Dunkirk perimeter, where over 300,000 Allied soldiers were trapped against the sea and evacuating in desperate circumstances. Near the town of Merville on May 27th, the Deutschland Regiment forced a bridgehead over the Ley River in intense fighting. The situation became desperate when British tanks penetrated to within 15 feet of Felix Steiner's command post. Only the timely arrival of an anti-tank platoon from the Totenkopf division saved the position from being overrun. After Dunkirk fell, the division joined the drive toward Paris. France surrendered in 6 weeks. The SS had proven itself capable of fighting and winning in conventional warfare against first-rate opponents. But it was in the Balkans, during the invasion of Yugoslavia in April 1941, that Das Reich produced one of the war's most audacious episodes. SS Hauptsturmführer Fritz Klingenberg commanded a motorcycle reconnaissance unit tasked with probing ahead of the main advance. On April 12th, he led a small group of men across the flooded Danube River in a repaired motorboat they had found on the north bank. After sending 2 men back for reinforcements, Klingenberg and approximately 6 soldiers drove into the center of Belgrade, the Yugoslav capital, on motorcycles, passing confused civilians and scattered resistance. Klingenberg found the city in chaos. The Yugoslav government had fled. There was no organized defense. He located the German legation building, raised a Nazi flag, and then presented himself to the mayor of Belgrade. Klingenberg bluffed outrageously, claiming that a massive German army waited just outside the city, supported by Luftwaffe bombers ready to reduce Belgrade to rubble if the surrender was refused. There was no army. There were no bombers. Klingenberg had fewer than 10 men with him, but the mayor believed him. Belgrade surrendered to a handful of SS troopers with a motorboat. Hitler awarded Klingenberg the Knight's Cross personally. However, during this same Balkan campaign, soldiers from the division murdered approximately 200 people at the village of Alibuna in Serbia on April 11th, including both civilians and Yugoslav army prisoners of war, in supposed reprisal for armed resistance from Yugoslav partisans. It was an early sign of the systematic brutality that would characterize Das Reich's operations throughout the war. The division was capable of extraordinary military feats. It was also capable of extraordinary crimes. Both capacities flowed from the same source, an ideological commitment so absolute that it removed all normal restraints on human behavior. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. This was the war Hitler had always wanted, a war of annihilation against what he called Jewish Bolshevism, a war that would provide living space for the German race in the East. 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border that morning, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft. It was the largest military operation in human history. SS Division Reich was assigned to Army Group Center under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock. Specifically, the division served within Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group, the armored spearhead of the drive toward Moscow. The division was attached to the 46th Panzer Corps, alongside the 10th Panzer Division and the elite Grossdeutschland Regiment. This was the main effort of the entire invasion. If Moscow fell, Germany believed the Soviet Union would collapse. The division crossed into Soviet territory on the first day of the invasion and advanced through the Pripyat marshes toward Mogilev and Smolensk. The fighting was intense from the beginning. Soviet resistance was far fiercer than German planners had anticipated. The Red Army fought stubbornly, often to the last man, but the Wehrmacht's tactical superiority prevailed repeatedly. The Germans encircled and destroyed one Soviet force after another. The advance continued eastward through the summer heat and the endless Russian steppe. In September, the division helped close the Kiev pocket, one of the largest encirclements in military history. German records claimed over 665,000 Red Army soldiers were captured in a single operation, though modern historians consider this figure inflated. It was nonetheless a stunning tactical victory. But that same month, elements of Das Reich crossed a moral line from which there was no return. A support unit of the division aided Einsatzgruppe B, one of the mobile killing squads that followed behind the German armies, in the murder of 920 Jews near the town of Lohoysk in the Minsk region. The division was now directly participating in the Holocaust. In early October, the Wehrmacht launched Operation Typhoon, the final drive on Moscow. Hitler and his generals believed one more great victory would knock the Soviet Union out of the war before winter set in. Das Reich advanced with the rest of the German forces, seizing the town of Gzatsk, crossing the Moskva River and taking Mozhaisk. The weather deteriorated rapidly. Autumn rains turned the roads into rivers of mud. Then the temperatures dropped. By late November, the division was fighting through conditions that defied description. Temperatures plunged to minus 40 degrees Celsius. Weapons froze solid. Engines refused to start. Men died from frostbite and hypothermia as readily as from enemy fire. Despite everything, lead elements of the division came within sight of Moscow's outskirts in early December 1941. The spires of the Kremlin were reportedly visible on the horizon. Victory seemed tantalizingly close. One more push, one more effort, and the Soviet capital might fall, but there would be no more pushes. The division had reached the absolute limit of its strength, just kilometers from the Soviet capital. The men were exhausted beyond measure. Many had not eaten a hot meal in weeks. Frost-bitten fingers could barely grip weapons. The horses that pulled the supply wagons were dying by the hundreds. The next day, December 5th, 1941, the Soviets launched their winter counteroffensive. Fresh divisions transferred from Siberia, equipped for winter warfare with quilted uniforms and white camouflage, slammed into the exhausted German lines. These Soviet soldiers were not the demoralized troops the Germans had been fighting all summer. They were well-trained, well-led, and fighting for the survival of their homeland. The Wehrmacht was pushed back from Moscow in chaos. Entire units disintegrated. The retreat threatened to become a rout. For Das Reich, the following months were a nightmare of defensive battles in conditions that killed men faster than enemy bullets. The division fought at Istra, at Ruza, at Rzhev, in a succession of desperate engagements against an enemy that seemed to have unlimited reserves of men and equipment. The toll was catastrophic. By February 1942, the division had lost 10,690 men, killed, wounded, missing, and frozen. The De Führer regiment was reduced from 2,000 men to just 35 men out of 2,000, a 98% casualty rate. Overall, the division lost 60% of its combat strength in the winter of 1941 to 1942. Paul Hausser himself was wounded on October 14, 1941, hit by shell splinters. He lost an eye and would wear a distinctive black eye patch for the rest of his life. He earned the Knight's Cross before handing command to Wilhelm Bittrich. In March 1942, the shattered remnants of Das Reich were finally withdrawn to France for rebuilding. The division that had nearly reached Moscow was a ghost of its former self. The division spent most of 1942 in France, receiving replacements, new equipment, and upgraded organization. It was during this period that Das Reich received its first tank regiment and was redesignated as a Panzer Grenadier Division. New Tiger heavy tanks began arriving in late 1942. The division's Tiger Company was authorized 9 of these massive vehicles plus 10 Panzer, 3 tanks, armed with the legendary 88mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. The division that returned to the Eastern Front in January 1943 was a very different formation from the one that had nearly died outside Moscow. The situation in the east had changed dramatically. The German 6th Army had just been destroyed at Stalingrad, the worst defeat in German military history. Approximately 285,000 German soldiers had been encircled, and most were killed or captured. The Soviets were exploiting their victory with massive offensives that threatened to collapse the entire German southern front. Soviet tank armies were racing westward, retaking cities and territory that Germany had conquered in 1941. Das Reich was rushed to the crisis zone as part of the newly established SS Panzer Corps under Paul Hausser, alongside the Leibstandart and Totenkopf divisions. For the first time, 3 elite SS divisions would fight together as a single corps. It was a formidable concentration of armored power. The city of Kharkov, the 4th largest in the Soviet Union and a major industrial center, had already fallen to the Red Army. Hitler ordered it held at all costs, but Hausser recognized that his corps faced encirclement and destruction if it obeyed. Soviet forces were closing in from 3 sides. To stay in Kharkov was to die in Kharkov. On the night of February 14th to 15th, 1943, Hausser defied Hitler's direct order and withdrew from the city to avoid being trapped. It was one of the very few occasions an SS general openly disobeyed the Führer. Kharkov fell to the Soviets on February 16th. But the withdrawal had saved the SS Panzer Corps for a counterstroke. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, the most brilliant operational commander in the German army, then launched his masterstroke. Beginning February 19th, the SS Panzer Corps struck southward from the town of Krasnograd. Das Reich and Totenkopf executed a 100-kilometer thrust that caught the overextended Soviet forces completely off guard. The Soviet 25th Tank Corps was destroyed by February 24th. By early March, the Soviet 3rd Tank Army was badly mauled. The tide was turning. On March 6th, the 3 SS divisions advanced abreast toward Kharkov, Totenkopf on the left, Leibstandarte in the center, Das Reich on the right. 4 days of savage house-to-house fighting followed. Street by street, building by building, the SS forced the Soviets back. The fighting was brutal and costly on both sides, but the Germans had momentum and firepower. On March 15th, 1943, Kharkov was recaptured. Belgrade fell 2 days later. The SS Panzer Corps suffered approximately 4,300 casualties in the operation. Soviet losses reached an estimated 70,000 to 90,000 killed, wounded, and captured. Dozens of tanks were left burning in the streets. The Red Army had been driven back over 100 kilometers in less than a month. For the men of Das Reich, this was vindication of everything they believed about themselves. They had turned a disaster into a triumph through sheer aggression and tactical skill. This was the last major German strategic victory of World War II. It would prove to be the high watermark of Das Reich's career. The recapture of Kharkov created a massive bulge in the Soviet lines around the city of Kursk. Both sides immediately recognized the strategic implications. The Soviets could defend the salient, fortify it in depth, and draw German forces into a trap that would bleed them white. The Germans could pinch off the salient with converging attacks from north and south and destroy the Soviet armies inside in another great encirclement. Hitler chose to attack. The result was Operation Citadel, the Battle of Kursk, which began on July 5, 1943. It would be history's largest tank battle, involving nearly 3 million soldiers and over 6,000 tanks and assault guns. The Soviets had months to prepare their defenses. They laid hundreds of thousands of mines. They dug thousands of kilometers of trenches. They positioned anti-tank guns in depth across defensive lines extending nearly 300 kilometers. They knew the attack was coming, and they were ready for it. Das Reich fought in the southern sector as part of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps within General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army. The division held the Corps' eastern flank during the advance toward the village of Prokhorovka. The fighting was desperate from the first day. German tanks advanced through minefields under constant artillery fire. Soviet defenders fought from prepared positions with suicidal determination. Every kilometer of advance cost hundreds of casualties. On July 12th, the Soviet 5th Guards tank army launched its famous counterattack at Prokhorovka. Modern scholarship estimates approximately 600 Soviet armored vehicles participated in the immediate sector, with additional forces committed across the wider area. Das Reich's sector saw heavy fighting against elements of the 2nd and 2nd Guards tank corps. The collision of armor was apocalyptic. Tanks fought at point-blank range. Vehicles burned across the steppe. Smoke obscured the battlefield. The offensive was cancelled on July 13th, after Hitler met with Manstein. The Allied invasion of Sicily had begun, and Hitler felt compelled to transfer forces to Italy. But even without Sicily, Citadel had failed. The German forces had penetrated only 35 kilometers into Soviet defenses. The Soviets had absorbed the blow and were preparing their own counteroffensives. Kursk was a strategic defeat for Germany. The initiative on the Eastern Front had passed permanently to the Soviet Union. After Kursk, the division fought a series of increasingly desperate defensive battles across Ukraine. In late July, it helped destroy 5 encircled Soviet divisions on the Mayas front. In August, it deployed Panther medium tanks for the first time during the defense of Kharkov. Kharkov itself was permanently lost on August 23, 1943, just 5 months after its recapture. Through the fall and winter, Das Reich conducted a fighting retreat through Poltava, across the Dnieper River, through Kiev, and to Zhytomyr. The division was constantly in action, constantly taking casualties, constantly retreating. The great victories of February and March seemed like ancient history. Now there was only the grinding attrition of a losing war. The division was redesignated as a full Panzer Division in October 1943. By early 1944, the battered formation was transferred to southern France to rebuild once again. It was the third time the division had been pulled from the Eastern Front to recover from devastating losses. By April 1944, Das Reich was stationed near the town of Montauban in southern France. The division numbered over 15,000 men under the command of SS Brigadeführer Heinz Lammerding. It was equipped with 37 Panzer IV tanks, 55 Panthers, and 30 Stu-G3 assault guns, somewhat below its full authorized strength. The men knew an Allied invasion was coming. They trained constantly, conducted exercises, and waited. They just did not know when or where the blow would fall. When D-Day came on June 6, 1944, Das Reich was ordered north to Normandy on June 7th. The division was approximately 700 kilometers from the invasion beaches. An unopposed rail movement would have covered that distance in 3 to 4 days. Instead, the journey would take over 2 weeks. And during that march, Das Reich would commit crimes that would forever define its legacy in history. The delay began with sabotage. Agents of the British Special Operations Executive had been operating in southern France for months, building networks of resistance fighters and preparing for the invasion. A network called Pimento, led by a British agent named Anthony Brooks, had systematically sabotaged railway cars by draining axle oil and replacing it with abrasive powder that caused the axles to overheat and seize. When the trains failed, the division was forced onto the roads. On the roads, Das Reich faced constant harassment from the French resistance. Approximately 20,000 Maquis fighters operated in the region, emboldened by the news of the Allied landings. They ambushed convoys with small arms fire, they cut telephone lines, they felled trees across roads, they sniped at officers and motorcycle couriers. After crossing the Loire River on June 13th, Allied aircraft joined the attacks. P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoon fighter bombers strafed the German columns by day, forcing them to move primarily at night. The division arrived at Normandy piecemeal between June 15th and June 30th, and was not fully reunited until July 10th. This 2-week delay demonstrably aided the Allied beachheads' consolidation during the critical early weeks of the invasion. But the military delay was not what would make the march infamous. During the journey northward, Das Reich conducted a campaign of terror against French civilians that produced two of the most horrific atrocities of the entire Western European War. The first occurred at the town of Toul on June 9, 1944. The day before, communist resistance fighters from the FTP had briefly liberated the town after intense fighting. When they withdrew upon hearing of the approaching SS column, approximately 40 German garrison soldiers were found dead. When Das Reich arrived, the SS was determined to make an example that would terrorize the entire region into submission. The SS rounded up nearly all men in the town between the ages of 16 and 60. After a selection process in which some men were released based on their occupation or the intervention of local officials, 99 men were hanged from lampposts, balconies, and trees along the main streets. The hangings continued throughout the afternoon. Bodies were left dangling as a warning to the population. A further 149 men were deported to the Dachau concentration camp in Germany, where 101 of them perished from brutal conditions. Total civilian deaths attributed to the Toulay operation reached 213. The following day, June 10, 1944, brought an even greater horror. SS Sturmbannführer Adolf Dieckmann led the 3rd Company of the 1st Battalion of the Der Führer Regiment into the village of Oradour-sur-Glane. This was a quiet village of approximately 650 inhabitants, swollen by refugees fleeing the fighting. Among them were 7 Jewish refugees who had sought safety in the countryside. The village had absolutely no connection to partisan activity. It was simply a peaceful farming community going about its daily life. The stated pretext for what followed was retaliation for the resistance's capture of an SS officer named Helmut Kampfer. But the most credible evidence suggests the village may have been confused with a different location named Oradour-sur-Vayres, or was deliberately targeted simply to terrorize the region into passivity. Whatever the actual reason, what followed was systematic mass murder planned and executed with terrible efficiency. All inhabitants were assembled in the market square around 2 in the afternoon. Soldiers went house to house, ordering everyone out, assuring them it was simply an identity check. Men were separated from women and children. The men, approximately 197 of them, were herded into 6 barns and garages around the village. The women and children, approximately 240 women and over 200 children, were locked inside the church. Then the killing began. Machine guns opened fire on the men in the barns, aiming at their legs to ensure they could not escape. The wounded were doused with fuel and burned alive. Those who tried to flee were shot down. An incendiary device was detonated inside the church. The explosion set fire to the wooden interior. Those who tried to escape through the windows were cut down by machine gun fire from soldiers positioned outside. The village was then systematically looted. Soldiers took valuables, food, and anything else of use. Then every building was set ablaze. The SS withdrew around 8 in the evening, leaving behind the smouldering ruins of an entire community. 642 people were dead. Only 7 people survived the massacre. 5 men escaped from the barns, shielded by the falling bodies of their neighbors and friends. They played dead while soldiers fired into the pile of corpses to ensure no one remained alive. One woman, Marguerite Ruffanche, age 47, leaped from a sacristy window after being shot 5 times. She crawled through a garden and hid among the plants until the Germans left. And a 7-year-old refugee boy named Roger Godfrin fled from the school before the roundup was complete. All 7 would live to bear witness to what had happened. Even within the German command structure, protests followed the massacre. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who commanded German forces in Normandy, was informed and expressed his outrage. General Gleiniger, the German commander in Limoges, and Das Reich regimental commander Sylvester Stadler both objected to what had happened. Stadler went further and ordered a court-martial for Diekmann. But Diekmann was killed in action in Normandy on June 29th, just 19 days after the massacre, and the matter was quietly dropped. There would be no wartime justice. Across southwest France during May through July 1944, 124 separate locations of atrocities committed by Das Reich have been documented by historians. Total civilian deaths during the march from Montauban to Normandy are estimated at approximately 4,000. In Normandy itself, Das Reich found itself plugging defensive gaps rather than conducting the armoured counterattacks it had trained for. Allied air superiority made large-scale armoured movements suicidal during daylight hours. The division participated in the German response to Operation Epsom, the British offensive around Hill 112 in late June. It fought through the hedgerow country called the bocage, terrain that characterized the Norman landscape and provided perfect defensive positions for infantry, but made armoured operations extremely difficult. On August 7th, Das Reich was one of the primary attacking formations during Operation Lüttich, Hitler's doomed counter-offensive toward the town of Avranches. The plan was to cut through the American lines and reach the coast, severing the supply lines of General Patton's forces breaking out across Brittany. It was a desperate gamble that might have worked earlier in the war. The attack at Mortain was a disaster. Forewarned by ultra-intelligence intercepts that had broken German codes, the Americans knew the attack was coming and were prepared. The 30th Infantry Division held critical positions on Hill 314 despite being surrounded for 6 days, from August 7th to August 12th. Allied aircraft, particularly P-47 Thunderbolts, armed with rockets and bombs, devastated the German armoured columns. The sky was so thick with Allied aircraft that German tanks could barely move without being attacked. Within 24 hours, the offensive had failed completely. Das Reich was subsequently caught in the Roncesvalles pocket, where Allied air power and American artillery destroyed over 260 combat vehicles and killed more than 1,150 men in a matter of days. The division escaped the larger Falaise pocket, the great encirclement that destroyed much of the German army in Normandy. By September 13th, 1944, division strength had dropped from 17,283 to 12,357. Nearly 5,000 men lost in Normandy alone, and most of the division's tanks and heavy equipment destroyed or abandoned. The division was withdrawn to Germany for rebuilding at Sauerland, south of Paderborn. By December 1944, it had been restored to approximately 18,000 men and re-equipped with Panthers, Tigers, assault guns, and tank destroyers. Das Reich was ready for one more offensive. The Battle of the Bulge began on December 16, 1944, when Germany launched its last major offensive in the west, through the Ardennes forest in Belgium. The goal was to split the American and British armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the west, so Germany could concentrate all its forces against the Soviets. It was a gamble born of desperation. Das Reich entered the battle as part of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps within Sepp Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army. The division's most significant engagement was the Battle of Baraque de Frauture, known to the Americans as Parker's Crossroads. There, approximately 300 to 400 American soldiers, an ad hoc force of infantry, artillery, and armour that had grown from an initial 100 artillerymen, held a critical road junction for 5 days, from December 19th to December 23rd, before being overwhelmed by the full weight of the division's attack. Das Reich swept through the town of Mannheim on Christmas Eve and pressed on into Grand Mesnil. For a few hours, it seemed the offensive might achieve a breakthrough. But American counterattacks by the 3rd Armoured Division and the 75th Infantry Division recaptured both positions by late December, the division never reached the Meuse River. By mid-January 1945, the Ardennes offensive had failed completely. Germany had expended its last strategic reserve for nothing. The Western Allies would soon be crossing the Rhine. In February 1945, Das Reich was transferred to Hungary for Operation Spring Awakening, the Lake Balaton offensive that began on March 6. This was the last German offensive of the entire war, a desperate attempt to secure the oil fields near the town of Nagy Kanisa. Without oil, Germany's tanks and aircraft were useless. Hitler believed capturing these fields could prolong the war. The offensive was doomed from the start. Spring thaw had turned the terrain into a quagmire of mud. King Tiger tanks, the most powerful armoured vehicles in the German inventory, weighing nearly 70 tons, sank in mud up to their turrets. Infantry could barely advance through terrain that swallowed men to their waists. Soviet defences, though not as elaborate as at Kursk, were still formidable. The attack gained approximately 30 kilometers before stalling completely. When the offensive failed, Hitler delivered a final humiliation to the SS divisions that had served him since before the war began. He ordered the SS divisions participating in the operation to remove their cuff bands, the cloth strips worn on the sleeve that bore the unit's name. These cuff bands were badges of honor, symbols of the unit's identity and history. Hitler declared the divisions had not fought adequately and did not deserve to wear the honorific. Sepp Dietrich reportedly refused to relay the order. Many cuff titles had already been removed for operational security purposes weeks earlier, but the symbolic rejection stung deeply for men who had bled for Germany on every front for 6 years. The division then fought a desperate retreat through Austria, defending bridges over the Danube River at Vienna. The city fell on April 13, 1945. What remained of Das Reich scattered across Czechoslovakia, fighting delaying actions against overwhelming Soviet forces. The war was clearly lost. The only question remaining was where and to whom the division would surrender. The choice was obvious to every man in the division. They had fought the Soviets from the gates of Moscow to the ruins of Budapest. They had participated in the murderous occupation of the East. They knew what capture by the Red Army would mean. Execution for some, decades in Siberian labor camps for others, a death sentence either way. They had to reach the American lines. And so, in the final days of the war, the remnants of the division raced westward. Otto Weidinger negotiated passage with Czech partisans. The column of 1,000 vehicles wound through the countryside. And on the morning of May 9, 1945, they surrendered to the 2nd United States Infantry Division near Pilsen. The odyssey of Das Reich was over. The story of Das Reich did not end with its surrender. Questions of accountability would follow its surviving members for decades. In 1953, a French military tribunal in Bordeaux tried 21 defendants for the Oradour massacre. 20 were convicted, with one German defendant acquitted on an alibi. But the presence of 14 Alsatian soldiers among the accused, men from the French border region who had been conscripted into the SS against their will after Germany annexed Alsace, created a political crisis that threatened to tear France apart. The French National Assembly passed an amnesty law on February 19, 1953, by a vote of 319 to 211, freeing the Alsatians. This provoked bitter protests in the Limousin region where Oradour was located. Victims' families returned their Legion of Honor medals and excluded government representatives from memorial ceremonies for nearly 2 decades. By 1958, all German defendants had also been released. The quest for justice had largely failed. Heinz Lammerding, the division commander during the atrocities, was sentenced to death in absentia by French courts, but he never faced justice. He lived openly as a successful building contractor in Düsseldorf, protected by West Germany's constitutional prohibition on extraditing its own citizens. France requested his extradition repeatedly. Germany refused repeatedly. Lammerding died of cancer on January 13, 1971, at a hospital in Bad Tolz. His funeral was attended by approximately 200 former SS comrades who came to pay their respects. The only individual officer convicted specifically for Oradour was Heinz Barth, a platoon leader identified by East German intelligence, the Stasi, in Grancy on June 14, 1981. He was tried in East Germany, sentenced to life imprisonment in 1983, and released on health grounds in 1997. He died in August 2007. He was the only person ever to serve significant prison time specifically for the massacre of 642 people. The village of Oradour-sur-Glane was never rebuilt. President Charles de Gaulle ordered that the ruins be preserved exactly as the SS left them on the evening of June 10, 1944. Today, visitors walk through the burned shells of buildings, past the rusted hulks of 1940s automobiles, into the church where the women and children died. A modern memorial centre tells the story with photographs, documents, and testimony. The streets are silent. The village stands as a permanent indictment of what men can do when ideology removes all moral restraint. The division's command passed through many hands as the war ground on. After Hausser came Wilhelm Bittrich, who would later command the 2nd SS Panzer Corps at Arnhem. Matthias Klein-Heisterkamp led the division through the desperate winter battles at Moscow. Georg Kepler oversaw the rebuilding in France. Herbert Ernst Wahl and Kurt Brassack held brief commands during the Kharkov fighting. Walter Kruger commanded at Kursk. Heinz Lammerding held command during the march through France and bears historical responsibility for Toul and Oradour. Christian Tixen assumed command on July 24, 1944, and was killed just 4 days later when his Kubelwagen was ambushed by a 2nd Armoured Division tank near Trelli. His body was not identified until 1967 through dental records from a distinctive bridge installed after a grenade wound in 1942. Otto Baum led the division through the Normandy retreat. Lammerding returned for a second command tenure in late 1944. Karl Kreutz, Werner Ostendorf, and Rudolf Lehmann all served as commanders in the final months, with Kreutz holding command twice, including at the surrender. Some were killed in action. Some were wounded multiple times. All served a regime that demanded everything and ultimately destroyed everything. The division's members earned approximately 72 Knight's Crosses during the war, the highest total of any SS formation, exceeding the Leibstandart, Viking, and Totenkopf divisions. A captured German army officer described it in Normandy as a fantastic division, marvelously equipped and composed of first-rate men. This was the paradox of Das Reich. The division's trajectory from its formation in 1939 to the shattered remnants that surrendered in Czechoslovakia in 1945 mirrors the arc of Nazi Germany itself. Initial spectacular success built on criminal foundations, overreach driven by ideological blindness, grinding attrition against enemies with superior resources, and finally, total destruction. Today, more than 80 years after the war's end, the ruins of Oradour-sur-Glane remain the division's most enduring monument. Not the military victories, not the Knight's Crosses, not the tactical achievements, the burned church where children died, the bullet-marked walls where men were shot, the silent streets where an entire community was erased in a single afternoon. Das Reich was indeed a panzer division that fought on every front. It fought in Poland, France, Yugoslavia, Greece, the Soviet Union, Normandy, Belgium, Germany, Hungary, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. It experienced victory and defeat, triumph and disaster, the heights of military achievement and the depths of human depravity, and in the end, it lost. It lost the war, it lost its men, it lost its equipment, and it lost any claim to honour that military valour might otherwise have earned. The regiment which had the honour of bearing the name Deutschland is now signing off. That was the final truth of Das Reich. All the tactical brilliance, all the fanatical determination, all the fearsome reputation meant nothing in the end. The panzer division that fought on every front lost on every front.